Sharon leaned against the balcony railing of her modest Lecky apartment, her eyes following the hazy lights of cars speeding through the night. Her fingers brushed the stem of a dried red rose kept between pages of a forgotten novel. It was the first rose Alan ever gave her, back when love still felt like a promise instead of a performance. She remembered that rainy night when they were just two broke lovers, walking home under one shared umbrella. Alan had dashed into a moving traffic jam, risking it all to buy a single rose from a roadside vendor. "For the only woman I'll ever fight Lagos traffic for," he had said with that grin that once made her heart flutter. That version of him felt like a dream now, one she desperately wished she hadn't woken up from. Their first apartment had no generator, yet they made candle-lit dinners feel like five-star dining. They'd dance barefoot to old Asa records on the dusty tiled floor, laughing about their dreams. Sharon used to write down every sweet thing he said, believing that love, once planted, would only bloom. One evening, lying on the floor, Alan had traced the back of her hand with his finger and whispered, "We're not rich, babe, but I'll spend my life making sure you never lack peace." Sharon had smiled with tears in her eyes, kissing his palm, thinking she had found a man who truly saw her. But marriage changed things, or maybe it revealed what had always been there. Somewhere along the way, Alan stopped looking at her like a person and started treating her like a burden. And as the years passed, the Alan who bought roses and made promises had vanished, leaving only coldness behind. Now, the only thing that bloomed in their home was silence. But that rose, now dry and colorless, remained her silent witness of a man who once loved her, or pretended well enough to convince them both. The promotion came on a Tuesday afternoon. Alan had rushed home, suit jacket slung over his shoulder and excitement bursting from his chest. "They made me regional director," he'd announced as he dropped his car keys on the table. Sharon, who had been preparing yam porridge in the kitchen, emerged with a bright smile and open arms. "I knew they'd see what I've always seen," she whispered as she hugged him. That night, she cooked his favorite meal and even wore the navy blue dress he once said made her look like a woman who knew things. But the Alan who once clung to her like breath was already slipping away. The next morning, he began scheduling dinners Sharon wasn't invited to, corporate events, team outings, investor drinks. When she asked if she could come along one evening, he barely looked up from his phone. "It's work, Sharon. You won't fit in," he said flatly. That one sentence settled between them like glass, sharp and quietly painful. Soon, Alan started referring to the company as his legacy, even though it had been built by his late father and co-managed by his uncle, Clement. At home, he became distracted, always typing, always planning, barely speaking to her unless it was about Genevieve's school fees or house maintenance. Sharon once attempted to ask about the logistics firm's quarterly board meeting, curious and genuinely trying to connect. Alan scoffed, placing his phone face down and chuckling dryly. "Sweetheart, I'm not sure you'd understand that kind of talk. It's beyond cooking and laundry." She blinked, stunned. "Is that what you think I am?" she asked softly. Alan didn't reply. He stood, stretched his back, and walked to the bedroom. That night, as she lay beside him, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above, Sharon realized something far scarier than infidelity. She was living with a man who no longer saw her. His world was expanding, and she wasn't even on the map. She thought of her mother's words, "Pride enters softly like perfume. By the time you notice, the scent has already taken over the whole room." The fragrance of pride was everywhere now, and Alan wore it like cologne. It began with small dismissals, the kind that could be brushed off, if they didn't pile up. Alan would interrupt her mid-sentence during casual dinners with friends, correcting her about things she hadn't even said. Once, while hosting colleagues at their home, Sharon had suggested they try a local catering company run by a friend. Alan had laughed, not politely but cruelly, and said, "No offense, but let's let professionals handle this. I don't want boiled rice and disappointment." Everyone chuckled, unsure whether to laugh at the joke or pity the silence that followed. Sharon excused herself and walked into the kitchen, her hands trembling as she washed already clean plates just to keep from crying. When she returned, Alan didn't even look up. The wounds weren't visible, but they ached more than any slap ever could. Soon, Sharon found herself apologizing for things she hadn't done, just to keep the air clear. If Alan misplaced his charger, she said sorry. If traffic delayed her from picking up his dry cleaning, she took the blame. It became her default. "I'm sorry," rolled off her tongue so often it lost meaning. One morning, while making breakfast, Genevieve spilled orange juice on Alan's suit jacket. Sharon sprang to clean it and apologized before even understanding what had happened. Alan looked at them both with disgust. "Do you two ever do anything right?" he muttered under his breath. Later that day, Sharon stood before the mirror, rubbing concealer under her eyes, not to hide bruises, but to disguise how tired she looked. Tired of trying, tired of shrinking, tired of loving a man who was slowly draining her sense of self. She looked at her reflection, whispering the words to herself like a prayer. "You're not stupid. You're not nothing." But the mirror didn't argue. It just stared back, silent and honest. And somewhere deep down, Sharon began to wonder, when did she stop being a person in her own home? It had taken her all evening to prepare his favorite pepper chicken with jollof rice, just the way he liked it, extra onions, no carrots. She wore a simple wine-colored wrapper with a silk blouse, her hair wrapped neatly, lip gloss dabbed gently. The dining table was set. Genevieve had even written "Welcome Home, Daddy" on a paper napkin in pink crayon. The time ticked past 7 p.m., then 8, then 9. Sharon reheated the food once, then twice. Finally, at 10:27 p.m., the gate clicked open. Alan strolled in, smelling of whiskey and cigars, tie loosened, laughter still on his lips from whatever gathering he had just left. Sharon stepped forward. "I made your," she began. "I already ate," he cut in. "Don't stress, I'm tired." And just like that, he walked past the table, ignoring the crayon napkin, the warm food, and the woman who'd waited for him all night. When she entered the kitchen to pack the untouched food into containers, her hands shook. Genevieve had fallen asleep on the couch, waiting. Sharon gently carried her to bed, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. Then, standing in the dim light of the fridge, she opened her phone. There it was, on Alan's WhatsApp status, a smiling selfie of him with a few colleagues at a rooftop bar. The caption read, "Success looks good on me." Her vision blurred. She pressed the phone to her chest and leaned against the fridge door. No tantrum, no confrontation, just quiet devastation. That night, she didn't eat. Instead, she sat at the dinner table alone and ate spoonfuls of silence. Across from her, Alan's untouched plate mocked her. For the first time, she didn't cry in front of him. She didn't even speak. But deep inside, something quietly broke, and it would never heal the same again. Saturday mornings used to be sacred, pancakes in the kitchen, cartoons in the living room, laughter echoing through the house. But now the silence on Saturday was heavy, pierced only by the low hum of the blender or the shuffle of Genevieve's tiny slippers as she entered the kitchen. Sharon was pouring pap into a bowl when her daughter tugged her wrapper and asked innocently, "Mummy, why doesn't Daddy laugh with you like before?" Sharon's hands froze mid-stir. The question stung more than any insult Alan had thrown at her lately. She turned slowly, managing a smile. "Daddy's just been busy, baby. Work makes people tired sometimes." But Genevieve wasn't convinced. Her big brown eyes searched her mother's face for a deeper answer, something she could hold on to, something that made sense in her 7-year-old world. "But he laughs with the people on the phone," she said, frowning. "He laughs all the time when he's not here." That night, Sharon sat by Genevieve's bed as she fell asleep, brushing back stray curls from her forehead. She stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time Alan had tucked their daughter in, read her a bedtime story, or even asked how her day went. The more she searched, the more empty her memory became. Sharon began journaling, writing down not just the things Alan did, but the small moments Genevieve noticed, his absence, his cold tone, how he never came to school events anymore. It wasn't just about what he did to Sharon, it was what he was failing to be for their daughter. And that realization pierced her more deeply than any insult ever could. The next morning, Genevieve found her mother crying softly at the sink. "Mummy, are you sad?" she asked. Sharon quickly wiped her tears and smiled. "No, baby, I'm just rinsing onions." But there were no onions in the sink. Just a woman who had no answers left for a child who saw too much too soon. The room glittered with fairy lights and business talk. It was the company's 10th anniversary, and Alan had insisted Sharon come. "Just wear something simple," he had said, as if she were his accessory, not his wife. Sharon chose a deep green dress with golden earrings, a nod to the girl she used to be, the one who liked to feel pretty. She smiled politely as Alan introduced her to shareholders and partners, nodding through conversations she wasn't included in. Midway through the evening, a group of executives began discussing investment strategies, and Sharon casually added, "Actually, I read an article about similar models in West Africa. It's interesting how logistics is adapting." Alan froze. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he chuckled and said, "You've been reading Forbes now. My wife thinks she's an analyst. Don't mind her. She's just a housewife trying to sound smart." Laughter trickled through the group, but it was uncomfortable. Sharon's face flushed. She smiled, nodded, and excused herself to the bathroom. She locked the door behind her and stood in front of the mirror, pressing a tissue to her face. Her hands were shaking. How had she become a punchline in a room full of strangers? Her phone buzzed. Susan had texted, "Don't mind him. You handled that with grace." Sharon stared at her reflection and whispered, "Why are you still here?" The woman in the mirror had no answer. After the party, Alan didn't apologize. On the drive home, he scrolled through his phone while she stared out the window. "Next time, just leave the business talk to me," he said casually, not even looking up. Sharon didn't respond. When they got home, she changed out of her dress, hung it back neatly, and curled up beside Genevieve, who was asleep in her bed. Sharon didn't cry that night, but the silence inside her was louder than any sob. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was the quiet burial of hope. Clement had always been the quieter half of the business, reserved, methodical, and slow to judge. He had known Sharon since her engagement to Alan, and had always admired her gentleness, especially during the early years when she used to bring Alan lunch to the office with hand-scribbled notes. Lately, though, he'd begun to notice changes, not just in Sharon, but in the way Alan moved. The arrogance, the dismissiveness, the way he spoke about his wife as if she were an afterthought. During board meetings, Clement observed how Alan would wave away her suggestions or smirk whenever her name came up. Something wasn't sitting right. And when Sharon stopped visiting the office altogether, Clement's unease deepened. One day he called Susan into his office and asked, "Has Sharon been by recently?" Susan hesitated, then replied softly, "Not for a while. And sir, she doesn't look like herself anymore." Clement began to piece things together slowly, her shrinking smile, the tightness in her shoulders, the silent way she stood beside Alan at events. He remembered once seeing her outside the office gate, waiting under the sun because her driver had been dismissed without notice. She'd said it was fine, but her shoes had mud on them, and her eyes looked tired. That memory stayed with him. One evening, after Alan stormed out of a meeting in frustration, Clement remained behind, staring at the documents. Then he closed the file and sighed. "The boy is flying too close to the sun," he muttered. He pulled out his old ledger and flipped to the company structure page. Sharon's name was nowhere on it, yet she had been the quiet support behind many of Alan's early decisions. He made a mental note to invite her over soon, not as a favor, but as a man who had once promised her father that he'd always look out for her. Clement knew what unchecked pride looked like, and he had no intention of letting it ruin another woman's life, not on his watch. The office lobby was quieter than usual that Thursday afternoon. Sharon had stopped by to drop off Genevieve's forgotten school project in Alan's car, which he'd left parked outside the building. She kept her sunglasses on as she waited by the reception, clutching the small cardboard model in her arms. Susan, seated behind the front desk, looked up and immediately stood. "Ma," she greeted softly, her eyes scanning Sharon's face with concern. "You can leave it, I'll get it to him," Susan offered. But Sharon shook her head. "No, I'll just wait for a moment." Her voice was flat, polite, and tired. As Sharon turned slightly to sit, the light caught her face, and Susan noticed the faint purple shadow beneath her right eye. It wasn't a bruise, not physical, but it was something deeper, darker, an emotional fatigue that makeup couldn't cover. Susan walked around the desk and gently placed her hand on Sharon's arm. "Ma, You deserve more than this, she whispered, glancing around to be sure no one was near. Sharon looked up, surprised. For a second, she wanted to protest, to dismiss it with a smile. But the look in Susan's eyes didn't invite pretenses. What do you mean? She asked, her voice wavering. Susan didn't flinch. I mean, I see how you carry yourself, and how he treats you. We all see it. But you act like it's okay. Sharon swallowed hard. I don't have the luxury of falling apart, Susan. There was silence. Then Susan nodded slowly. That's what makes you stronger than all of us. But please, don't let him take your light completely. Sharon blinked, her vision blurring. No one had ever said that to her, not even her own family. She left shortly after, but that conversation stayed with her. Susan had spoken gently, but it cut straight through Sharon's numbness. On her way home, stuck in traffic, she thought about all the times she smiled through disrespect, all the times she stayed quiet to keep the peace. Her strength had been mistaken for silence. But someone had finally seen her, and that flicker of recognition was enough to stir something in her heart she thought had died. Not hope, not yet, but awareness. That night, after Genevieve fell asleep hugging her stuffed lion, Sharon stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her teeth, watching herself closely. There was something unnerving about confronting your own reflection at midnight, no makeup, no mask, just the honest wreckage of what was left. She rinsed her mouth, turned off the light, and crawled into bed beside her daughter, wrapping her arms around the small body that still brought her warmth. But she couldn't sleep. The silence in the room was thick, her thoughts restless. Eventually, she reached for the journal hidden beneath her bed, an old leather-bound notebook that once held dreams and now documented damage. She flipped through the pages. April 14th. He didn't come home till 2 a.m. May 5th. He called me dense in front of Genevieve. June 10th. He told me I should be grateful someone like him chose me. There were more entries. Too many. Her pen hovered over the next page. She hesitated, then began writing. Today, a woman reminded me I'm still worth something. Her name is Susan. I don't know why her words shook me. Maybe because they came from someone who didn't owe me kindness. Maybe because I need to hear it. She paused, the ink blotting at the edge of the sentence. Sharon wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and closed the book. Lying on her back, she stared at the ceiling and whispered, God, if you see me, say something. There was no voice, no sign. But a deep breath settled in her chest, like the air had shifted, just slightly. The kind of shift that comes before a storm. She rolled over, pulled the blanket tighter, and kissed Genevieve's forehead. The pain hadn't stopped, but for the first time in years, she acknowledged it as pain, not her fault, not something to normalize, but pain she could name. That night, the pillow soaked her tears. But for once, they weren't just tears of helplessness. They were tears of awakening. Clement's voice over the phone was firm but gentle. Sharon, come over for tea. Tomorrow. No excuses. She was startled. He hadn't reached out personally in months. Tea, she asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Yes, he replied. You used to bring me ginger tea in the early days, remember? It's my turn. The next morning, Sharon arrived at Clement's home in Victoria Island, a quiet tree-lined compound that smelled of history and old books. He greeted her with a warm smile and a long hug, longer than she expected. They settled in the garden, with tea served in cream-colored china. Clement studied her closely before speaking. I may be an old man, but I'm not blind. Alan is spiraling, and I know it's you who's paying the price. Sharon looked away, eyes glistening. It's not my place to say anything, she murmured. He's your nephew. Clement leaned forward. Which is exactly why I have to say something. Because if I don't, I'll be a coward in the name of loyalty. Sharon said nothing for a long time. The breeze rustled the leaves above them. Then finally, she whispered, I don't know how to leave, Clement. I don't know what's left of me. He reached out, placing a firm hand on hers. What's left of you, he said quietly, is more than enough to rebuild everything. You've been weathering a storm alone, but storms end. They always end. She stared at him, her lips trembling. What if I fall apart? Clement's eyes softened. Then fall apart, Sharon, fall. I'll help you stand again. Tears slid down her cheeks as she nodded silently. She hadn't come for rescue, but what he gave her was something more powerful, permission. Permission to admit she was tired. Permission to stop enduring. Permission to start thinking about herself. As she left his house, she looked back once, half expecting the weight on her shoulders to return. It didn't, not entirely. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking alone. Clement had planted something in her that morning, a seed of belief. One that would soon grow into something Alan never saw coming. It started with a small drawer in Alan's home office, the one that used to hold loose receipts, business cards, and the odd travel itinerary. One afternoon, while dusting, Sharon noticed it wouldn't open. She pulled gently, then a bit harder. Nothing. When Alan returned later that evening, she mentioned it casually. "The bottom drawer seems jammed," she said, avoiding eye contact. "I locked it," he replied simply, without explanation, and walked away. That moment wasn't loud, but it screamed at her. Sharon had always been the one to organize his documents, file their tax records, even help him design presentation slides when the company was still young. But now he was locking her out, not just of drawers, but of his world. That night, while Alan showered, she crept into the office, opened his briefcase, and skimmed the contents. Invoices, meeting notes, legal papers with unfamiliar titles. Something was shifting under her feet, and she needed to know what. The next morning, she scheduled an appointment with a discreet female lawyer referred by a neighbor she trusted. She didn't tell Clement, not yet. She just needed information. At the law firm's modest Surulaire office, Sharon sat stiffly across from the woman in a simple gray suit who didn't ask many questions. "You're not crazy," the lawyer said after reading through the timeline Sharon had prepared. "You're in survival mode. We'll get everything documented." That evening, Sharon began her own records. She took photos of documents Alan left lying around, scanned his calendar on the dining table when he forgot to lock it, and started creating a digital folder on a hidden drive. She noticed meetings labeled separation consult and transfers she hadn't been told about. Whatever he was planning, he thought she'd remain unaware. But Sharon was learning to listen between silences. One night, she opened her prayer journal and scribbled something new on the back page. "If he's preparing for war, I'll learn how to protect myself too." It wasn't vengeance she wanted. It was the right to stand. And for the first time in years, Sharon stopped feeling like a passenger in her own life. She was learning the map, and soon she would be the one driving. Alan's distance took on a new form, ice-cold cordiality. He no longer raised his voice, but his silence now carried a strange authority, like a man tolerating an unwanted guest. Sharon noticed the change. He wasn't even pretending anymore. He stayed out later, returned with cologne that wasn't hers, and answered phone calls in hushed tones, stepping into the bathroom with the door shut. One evening, as he dressed for yet another urgent dinner with investors, Sharon stood by the doorway and asked gently, "Do you still consider this your home?" Alan paused as he buttoned his cuffs, looked her in the eye, and replied, "Don't start, Sharon. You always ruin the mood with your questions." She didn't argue. She just watched him leave and closed the door behind him slowly. Then she walked into the kitchen, poured herself water, and stood in silence for 15 minutes. That night she didn't cry. She took notes. She began to detach quietly, emotionally, strategically. When Alan was home, she kept things brief. Conversations centered around Genevieve. Meals were prepared without warmth or expectation. It didn't notice. Sharon had become invisible to him, and strangely, that worked in her favor. Her lawyer advised her to stay still, observe, document, and don't alert the fire until you're ready to leave the house. She followed that advice. She backed up files, contacted a property evaluator, and started printing emails she wasn't supposed to see. Susan helped quietly, slipping her access badges to retrieve documents at the office when Alan was away. Clement hadn't called again yet, but Sharon could sense something was brewing beneath the surface of that silence. At night, Genevieve would ask, "Mummy, why is Daddy always gone?" And Sharon would say, "He's finding himself." But deep down she knew he wasn't finding anything. He was losing everything slowly, and she was just beginning to see it. It wasn't pain she felt anymore. It was preparation. She arrived. Susan was the first to greet her. She smiled like someone who had been waiting to exhale. Clement met Sharon in the conference room with a third person, a sharply dressed man in his early 30s with calm eyes and a confident posture. Sharon, this is Tyler. He's a business analyst and strategist I've worked with on a few joint projects. If things were to change, he's someone I'd trust to help rebuild. Sharon blinked. Change how? Clement leaned forward. You've been holding up a man and a company without credit. If you ever decide to claim your place, you'll need people around you who know what respect looks like. Tyler is one of them. Tyler extended his hand. Ma'am, he said with a respectful nod, I've read about your insights from past board memos. I'd be honored to work under your leadership someday. Sharon was speechless for a moment. No one had ever said that to her, under your leadership. She sat down slowly, overwhelmed but composed. Why are you doing this, Clement? She asked quietly. Because I made your father a promise, he replied. And because I refuse to stand by while someone strong forgets her strength. For the rest of the meeting, Tyler walked her through company trends, where gaps were forming, and how Alan had made several careless moves that threatened the business's long-term health. Sharon listened intently, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a strange energy she hadn't felt in years. When she finally rose to leave, Clement placed a sealed envelope in her hand. Read this when you get home. It's a contingency, for when you're ready. As she exited the building, Susan gave her a look of quiet solidarity. Sharon got into her car, closed the door, and stared at the envelope on the passenger seat. For the first time, she saw herself not as Alan's wife, but as a woman holding a door only she could walk through. And the key was already in her hand. The envelope Clement had handed her sat untouched on her bedside table for 2 days. Sharon stared at it each morning while tying her head wrap, debating whether she was ready for whatever truth it contained. On the third night, after putting Genevieve to sleep, she finally sat down and opened it. Inside were legal documents, property transfer deeds, company ownership restructuring, and a notarized letter from Clement. The contents were clear. He had officially transferred 40% of the company shares and full ownership of the family house to her. The signatures were real. The stamp from the Corporate Affairs Commission was visible. Sharon read and reread the documents, hands trembling. Clement had made her the majority stakeholder in the business. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not out of joy or sadness but disbelief. For the first time in years, someone had given her power without demanding her silence in return. The next day, she returned to her lawyer's office with the envelope. The lawyer read through everything with narrowed eyes, then looked up, impressed. You realize this makes you the majority decision-maker in the business, right? Sharon nodded slowly. And the house? Fully yours, the lawyer confirmed. There's nothing Alan can do. The transfer is airtight and irrevocable. Sharon sat back, a mix of dread and power coursing through her chest. I don't want revenge, she whispered. I just want to be safe. I want my daughter to grow up with dignity. The lawyer leaned forward. Then don't use this to destroy him. Use it to protect yourself. Sharon signed her part of the documents with a quiet, shaking breath. This isn't revenge, she murmured. It's insurance. As she walked out of the building, she felt the city buzzing around her, the chaos of Lagos untouched by her personal war. But inside her, something had shifted permanently. The girl who once shrank into corners had just put her name on the title of everything she was told she'd never own. And she wasn't planning on losing it again. It came in the form of a knock, sharp, deliberate, official. Sharon opened the door to find a courier holding a manila envelope. For Mrs. Sharon Anderson, he announced before handing it over and walking away. Her name was printed in bold letters across the front, along with a law firm she recognized as Allen's. She didn't need to open it to know what it was, but she did carefully with steady hands. The words stared back at her like a slap. Petition for dissolution of marriage. She sat down slowly on the couch, staring at the documents without blinking. It wasn't a shock. It was more like the end of a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A weight both expected and surreal. She heard the gate open minutes later. Alan had arrived home. She placed the envelope gently on the table, stood up, and walked to the kitchen. When he entered, she didn't speak. Neither did he. For once, silence said everything. Later that evening, while folding Genevieve's clothes, Sharon found herself humming an old hymn. Genevieve entered the room holding a drawing. "Mummy, did Daddy send you bad news?" she asked, her small voice laced with worry. Sharon looked at her daughter, sat down, and pulled her close. "He did something grown-ups do when they stop being friends," she said gently. "Is it going to hurt you?" Genevieve asked. Sharon paused, then smiled through tears. "No, baby, not anymore. This is good. This is our new beginning." That night, she placed the divorce papers beside her journal and wrote only one line. "He thinks he's walking away, but I'm the one being set free." Then she turned off the light, curled around Genevieve, and for the first time in a long while, slept without fear of the door opening in anger. The world hadn't changed, but Sharon had, and she knew now some endings were really just carefully disguised escapes. As the hearing date drew closer, whispers began circulating through the company. Staff started noticing Alan's mood shifts, the late nights, the unannounced meetings. Some whispered that Sharon was planning something. Others said Alan had already won, that she'd be tossed out without a kobo. But Sharon kept her head down and her moves quiet. She moved out of the family house into a small, clean 2-bedroom apartment in Acacia, signing a 6-month lease under a different name. Only her lawyer, Clement, and Susan knew where she lived. Genevieve asked, "Is this a holiday house?" Sharon smiled and replied, "It's a peaceful house." She began building a new rhythm, packing lunches, doing school drop-offs herself, and calling Clement in the evenings to discuss final preparations. Alan, unaware of her strategic withdrawal, remained confident. He told business partners over drinks, "She'll walk out of that court with her last name, if she's lucky." One morning at the office, Sharon crossed paths with Alan in the parking lot. He stopped and gave her a long, amused glance. "So you're really going through with this?" he asked, hands in his pockets. Sharon nodded without emotion. "You started it." He shrugged. "You know the court doesn't care for tears, right? Hope you've got a place to land." She didn't flinch. "I do, better than you think." That reply wiped the smirk off his face. He scoffed and walked away, but Sharon saw it, the flicker of confusion, the brief stutter in his confidence. That evening, she rehearsed her statements with her lawyer, revisited every document, and packed a small folder with all the evidence she had gathered. It wasn't just a legal fight, it was the final step in reclaiming her voice. As the weekend approached, she stood by the window of her apartment, watching the streetlights blink through the night. She wasn't scared of the courtroom. She was ready, and the man who thought she'd beg for mercy was about to find out what dignity looked like on a woman who no longer needed his name to define her. The office felt colder that Monday morning, not because of the air conditioning, but because Sharon knew it would be her last quiet visit. She arrived just after 7 a.m., long before most of the staff. Susan met her by the back entrance, handing her a slim access card and a folded paper bag. "Your key to the archive room," she whispered. "He's at the island branch all day. You've got time." Sharon nodded, heart pounding, and slipped through the dim hallways with the weight of finality trailing her steps. Inside the archive room, she pulled down boxes, one after the other, contracts, invoices, signed authorizations, everything Alan had once boasted about controlling. She gathered only what mattered. Receipts with his name, amendments without board approval, financial transfers that showed he'd siphoned funds into private accounts. The facts were there. She didn't need to lie to win. She just needed the truth to breathe. By noon, she had locked the evidence into her briefcase and headed to the top floor, one last look at the office that had once been a second home. The framed photos of company founders still lined the corridor. She paused by one, a younger Alan shaking hands with Clement. Sharon stared at it, remembering how proud he'd been that day. A bitter smile touched her lips. Behind her, Susan approached silently. "It's all set," she whispered. "Your desk's been cleared. Your files are with your lawyer. HR doesn't even know you've left yet." Sharon turned to her, eyes heavy. "Thank you, Susan. You've done more for me than I can ever repay." Susan hesitated, then hugged her tightly. "Just promise me," she said. "Don't come back here unless your name's on the door." Sharon left through the side exit, head held high. As she stepped into the sun, the The weight of that building seemed to fall off her shoulders like a coat she no longer needed to wear. She wasn't disappearing, she was re-emerging. On her terms, the meeting was brief but powerful. Sharon sat across from her lawyer, her folder neatly organized, her mind clear. The lawyer opened the documents Sharon had assembled, scanning them silently. After a long pause, she leaned back in her chair and gave a small, proud smile. This is ironclad. Sharon, I've handled over 24 divorce cases this year, and not one woman came this prepared. Sharon exhaled slowly, her hands finally unclenching. I didn't want to fight dirty, she said softly. I just wanted to be ready. The lawyer nodded. You didn't fight dirty, you fought smart. She slid the final court motion across the table. All that's left is to show up. Sharon picked up the pen, signed her name with deliberate care, and slid it back. It felt less like a signature and more like a release, a final break from years of humiliation no one had seen but her. As they rose to leave, the lawyer placed a reassuring hand on Sharon's shoulder. You may look like you've lost everything to outsiders, she said gently. But they don't know you're the one holding the match. Sharon smiled faintly. Let them think I'm broken. That's the safest place to begin. She left the law office in silence, driving home as traffic honked and surged around her. On her dashboard sat a small photo of Genevieve from her 6th birthday. Sharon stared at it during red lights, reminded of what this was really about, not ego, not revenge, but legacy. She reached home before sundown and found Genevieve coloring at the dining table. Mummy, can we bake banana bread tomorrow? The girl asked. Of course, love, Sharon replied, kneeling to kiss her forehead. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, Sharon pulled out her court outfit, laid it across the bed, and sat quietly beside it. Tomorrow would be loud, cold, and public, but tonight was hers, a final calm before the world watched her rise. The apartment was quiet, wrapped in that peculiar stillness that precedes something final. Sharon sat at her small dining table with a cup of warm hibiscus tea, her hands wrapped around the mug like it could keep her grounded. Genevieve had already been tucked in, her small body curled around her favorite stuffed lion, unaware of what the next day would mean for her family. Sharon opened the drawer beneath the table and pulled out an old shoebox. Inside were remnants of a woman she used to be, her wedding invitation, a dried flower from their honeymoon dinner, a note Alan had once scribbled on her birthday. You'll always be my queen. She unfolded it with shaking fingers, the ink faded but the wound still fresh. Without a word, she stood, lit a candle, and burned the note over the kitchen sink. The flame flickered briefly, then swallowed the past. She watched the ashes fall and whispered, Thank you for the lesson. Afterward, she pulled out her wedding dress from the back of the wardrobe. It was simple, lace sleeves, ivory satin, slightly yellowed from time. She stared at it long and hard, then packed it carefully into a box. Not out of sentiment, but because it no longer belonged to her story. She sat by the window with her journal and began to write. Tomorrow, I face the man who taught me silence. But he also taught me strength. I'm not walking in to beg, I'm walking in to end what should have never been allowed to continue. Her pen paused. She flipped the page and wrote another line. My name is Sharon Anderson, and I'm not his wife anymore. I'm my own woman now. Just as she closed the book, her phone buzzed, an unsaved number, a message that read, Good luck tomorrow. You don't need it, but I'm rooting for you. C. She smiled faintly. Clement didn't say much, but he always said enough. Sharon walked to her daughter's room, kissed her good night once more, and then returned to bed. As she lay beneath the covers, she prayed, not for Alan to lose, but for her to never forget who she had become. Dawn would come soon, and with it, the first day of her real freedom. The courtroom was packed with quiet tension, lawyers shifting papers, a clerk organizing files, a bailiff calling names in a monotone voice. Sharon sat still on the wooden bench, dressed in a navy blue blouse and charcoal trousers, her hair neatly wrapped. She didn't fidget. She didn't cry. She waited. Across the room, Alan leaned back in his chair with a smirk, one arm lazily thrown across the backrest. He wore a crisp white kaftan and brown leather sandals, looking more like a man heading to a naming ceremony than a legal dissolution. When the judge entered, everyone rose. Sharon did too, not out of obligation, but because this was her moment. The proceedings moved quickly. Alan's lawyer made a confident case, citing irreconcilable differences, positioning Alan as the aggrieved, and barely acknowledging Sharon's contributions. Her lawyer, poised and calm, spoke when needed. No theatrics, just facts. Sharon said only a few words when asked, "Yes, I understand the terms. Yes, I agree to the dissolution." There was no fanfare. Just a stamp, a gavel, and then silence. Outside, the sun was brutal. Sharon stepped out, clutching the file that now held her freedom, her hands steady. She walked down the steps slowly, breathing deeply. Her heart didn't race, it settled. Then came Alan, sauntering out with two friends from work, laughing loudly. "She didn't even speak up," he jeered. "I told you she'd fold like paper." One of the men chuckled uneasily. Sharon stood off to the side beneath a tree, her face tilted upward as tears slid down her cheeks. Alan saw her, pointed, and said mockingly, "You see? She's crying already. These weak women, ain't." He turned away, triumphant, as if he'd won a game he designed. But Sharon's tears weren't for him. They were for herself, for the girl who once begged for his love, who stayed longer than she should have. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," under her breath. Because Alan had no idea he had just walked out of a house and company he no longer owned. He didn't know the house keys were no longer his. He didn't know the boardroom now answered to her. And that laughter, it would be the last sound of victory he'd ever make over her. The court had set her free. But she had already left him long before that gavel came down. 2 days after the hearing, Alan arrived at the company's main branch, his sunglasses on, chin up, swagger in place. He strolled past the security like he owned the air and approached the biometric scanner. The red light blinked twice. Access denied. He frowned, tried again. Same result. The guard by the entrance approached hesitantly. "Sir, I think there's a new protocol." "You may need to see HR," Alan scoffed. "I built this place. Move aside." But when he pushed the door, it didn't budge. He stepped back, confused, then noticed the receptionist, Susan, watching him from behind the front desk with a strange, unreadable look. He stormed in through the open side entrance, passing through familiar hallways until he reached the executive wing. Then he froze. Mounted in gold letters above the conference room entrance was a new plaque. Lead shareholder, Sharon N. Anderson. He blinked, stepped closer, as if the letters might rearrange themselves. But they didn't. Inside the room, Tyler was seated at the head of the table, reviewing reports. He looked up as Alan entered. "You're not authorized to be here anymore," he said calmly. Alan laughed bitterly. "Is this a joke? What is this?" Tyler stood, walked over, and handed him a sealed envelope. From the board. "Effective immediately, all shares under Clement's holding have been legally transferred. Sharon Anderson is now the majority stakeholder. Your previous privileges have been revoked." Alan's eyes darted between the envelope and the plaque, then to Tyler's expressionless face. "This is madness," he said under his breath. "Where's Clement?" Tyler didn't flinch. "On sabbatical. He trusts Sharon with the reins." Alan's shoulders dropped, his voice low. "She set me up." Tyler met his gaze without malice. "She protected herself." "You gave her the reason." Alan backed out slowly, hands trembling. The hallway felt colder now, the silence heavier. As he turned the corner, he glanced back at the plaque once more. Her name shined against the wall like a crown he'd never wear again. The woman he'd once called weak had just inherited everything he thought untouchable. And for the first time in a long time, Alan didn't feel powerful. He felt lost. The next morning, Alan returned early, hoping it had all been a misunderstanding, a temporary glitch, something reversible. But the access card still blinked red. This time, the security guard didn't move aside. "Sir, you'll need clearance from the new office," he said. "I am the office," Alan barked. "You've made a mistake!" The guard lowered his eyes. "We were instructed not to admit you, sir. Management orders." Alan stood there, baffled. The staff entering the building began to slow down, glancing awkwardly at the scene. Susan approached from inside, holding a cup of tea. "Mr. Allen," she said politely, "would you like me to call HR for clarity?" Alan's jaw tightened. What exactly did she do? Susan's eyes remained calm. "She didn't destroy you, sir. She just took back what she helped build." Infuriated, Alan stormed toward Clement's office suite, only to find the door sealed and the nameplate removed. It now read, "Reserved Executive Development." As he turned to leave, he ran into Clement himself, walking out of the elevator in a navy agbada and leather sandals. Alan rushed forward. "Uncle, what's going on here?" "You let her." Clement held up a hand. "I watched you grow this business, and I watched you poison it with pride." Alan's face paled. "But you gave her everything, without even asking me." Clement's voice was calm but firm. "You stopped asking her a long time ago. You locked her out of a marriage, a home, and a company. I simply gave her back the keys." Alan was speechless. Clement looked at him one last time before walking past. "This was never yours alone, Alan. You just thought it was." And with that, he left him standing there in the hallway, a man with no door to open, no name on the wall, and no one left willing to explain how the empire he mocked her in had become her throne. Alan's hands trembled as he turned the key in the front gate. The lock jammed. He twisted harder, but it refused to yield. Confused, he pulled out his phone and called the caretaker. "Why isn't the gate opening?" he demanded. The man hesitated. "Madam asked us to change the locks, sir." Alan blinked. "What did you just say?" The line crackled. "The property is now in her name. We got official notice 2 weeks ago. I thought you knew." Alan ended the call without a word, gripping the gate like it had betrayed him. The house loomed beyond the bars, his supposed fortress, now unreachable. The curtains were drawn, the driveway was empty, and the echoes of his old life were trapped inside walls he no longer controlled. He paced outside, hoping someone would open the gate, but no one came. Just the neighbor's dog barking in the distance and the sound of his own heart racing in disbelief. He drove to Genevieve's school that afternoon, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sharon during pickup. But the teacher informed him politely, "Ms. Anderson sent a note that she'll handle pickups and drop-offs going forward." Alan nodded stiffly, masking his confusion. That night, he returned to the house once more, peering through the metal bars like an outsider. No lights came on, no movement inside. The life he had mocked, neglected, and eventually discarded had disappeared completely, and he had no idea where it went. Back in his hotel room, he opened a bottle of whiskey and stared at the ceiling, the silence heavier than anything he'd felt in years. The realization landed hard. The woman he thought would never leave had not only left, she had taken everything. Not in anger, but in complete, haunting silence. The kind of silence that doesn't seek revenge, only closure. And for the first time, Alan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Irrelevant. Alan's days blurred into each other like fog over a broken windshield. The once powerful man found himself answering calls that were no longer flattering, but curious, even cautious. "Hey, Alan, just checking in," one friend said, voice laced with pity. "Heard there was a shake-up." Alan muttered something about temporary board restructuring, but the lie didn't even convince himself. His social circle thinned with each passing week. The women who used to call him boss man now ignored his texts. One even blocked his number. At the car dealership, his SUV was repossessed after 3 missed payments. His bank accounts had been frozen pending final asset settlement. He stood in the parking lot watching the tow truck pull away his last symbol of status, hands in his pockets, laughter long gone from his lips. He tried to sue Sharon, tried being the keyword. His new lawyer looked over the case and shook his head slowly. "She has you cornered. Every document was signed legally, every transfer filed publicly. There's no loophole here." Alan banged the desk. "She tricked me." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. Or maybe she just stopped playing dumb. Alan left the office with a headache and a growing sense of humiliation. Days passed without a single win. When he showed up uninvited at Genevieve's school concert, he was asked to wait outside. Sharon didn't look at him once. That night, alone in his hotel bed, he stared at his reflection in the dark window. His pride had built a fortress, and now he was its only prisoner. He began skipping meals, sleeping during the day, wandering through malls without buying anything. And still, no one called him sir anymore. For the first time in his life, Alan couldn't fix anything, because what was broken wasn't just around him, it was inside him. The first letter was short. "Sharon, I know I hurt you. I didn't expect things to end this way. I miss Genevieve. Can we talk?" He left it with the receptionist at Sharon's new company office. It was returned the next day, unopened, sealed with a note. She does not accept personal correspondence at work. Alan tried again, this time through Genevieve. Tell Mummy I'm sorry. Tell her I wrote her a letter. Genevieve tilted her head, confused. Why don't you just say it yourself? He knelt beside her, because sometimes grown-ups need help saying sorry. She nodded and skipped off. But when Sharon opened Genevieve's backpack and found the envelope, she placed it gently in the drawer. She didn't open it. She didn't respond. Not out of bitterness, but because peace doesn't argue with chaos. Weeks passed. Alan wrote more letters. Apologies turned to confessions, then to desperate questions. What can I do to fix this? Please let me explain. Can we meet once, just once? Each one came back the same, unopened, untouched, returned in silence. Eventually, he stopped writing. Not because he didn't care, but because he realized something far more painful. Sharon didn't need him anymore. Not emotionally, not financially, not for validation, not even for closure. She had found her healing elsewhere, in herself, in her daughter, in the stillness of dignity. The same woman he once told, "You're lucky I married you," had now become a version of herself that no longer required his presence to feel whole. And Alan, standing at the gates of a life he used to control, finally understood, rebuilding wouldn't begin with her forgiveness. It would begin with his repentance. The elevator doors opened to reveal Alan, slightly overdressed in a navy suit that no longer sat right on his shoulders. His shoes were polished, but his eyes were tired. He had come to drop off one last letter, only this time not to plead. He just wanted to leave it quietly with Susan and walk away. But as he stepped out into the lobby, he was surprised to find Tyler waiting for him near the reception. "Mr. Allen," Tyler said, voice measured. "I've been expecting you." Allen raised a brow. "You have?" Tyler nodded. "You're not banned from the building. Sharon never gave that order, but she also won't tolerate chaos. She asked me to pass along something. An opportunity, not a position, an offer." Allen's pride flinched. "What kind of offer?" Tyler looked him in the eye. "A junior consultancy role. No title. No office. You'll start from the floor. Learn the business again, this time with humility." Allen's lips parted in disbelief. "She wants me to be, what, an intern?" Tyler's gaze remained steady. "She wants you to experience what she endured, being overlooked, underestimated, and still showing up with excellence." Allen looked around, taking in the unfamiliar energy of the company he once ruled. People no longer bowed their heads when he walked by. No one whispered. It wasn't fear driving this office anymore. It was focus. "And if I refuse?" Allen asked. Tyler shrugged. "Then you walk away unchanged. But if you accept, maybe this is your way back. Not to her heart, but to your own soul." Allen said nothing for a long time. He walked to the window, staring out at the city that once cheered his success. "Tell her I'll start Monday," he finally muttered. "No suit, no expectation, just me." Tyler nodded. "That's all she wants." As Allen left the building, he didn't feel victorious. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel hollow either. Allen's first day as a junior staffer began with confusion. He reported to a 27-year-old team lead who handed him a folder of client briefs and said, "We need summaries by close of day. No special treatment, no deference. Just work." And that was the point. Every task forced him to engage, not command. He spent his days in the open plan workspace, typing reports, fixing coffee, running errands, and sitting through feedback sessions led by people who used to tremble at his name. In those quiet hours, something inside him began to shift. He listened more, spoke less. One afternoon during a lunch break, a younger staff member leaned over and said, "You're surprisingly easy to talk to." Allen smiled faintly, wiping his hands. "That's new for me," he admitted. "But I'm trying." And for once, it wasn't a performance. Outside of work, Allen began attending a men's support group, not to check a box, but because he needed help naming the parts of himself he'd ignored. He stood in a circle with strangers and confessed, "I used to think power made me worthy. I know now that it made me blind." He volunteered to clean after sessions, not because anyone asked, but because he understood that rebuilding began with service. On weekends, he visited his mother, something he hadn't done in years, and apologized without excuses. He no longer wore designer clothes to prove a point. Instead, he focused on being present. At the office, his reports were now referenced in meetings. Tyler nodded at him one morning and said, "You're starting to sound like a leader, not a boss." And still, through it all, Sharon said nothing. She observed from afar, never interfering, never acknowledging, but always watching. And that was enough to keep him grounded, because real change didn't come with applause. It came in the quiet moments when no one was watching, and he chose the right thing anyway. Clement's compound was still the same, sunlight filtering through palm trees, birds chirping in the distance, the gentle scent of hibiscus in the air. Alan hadn't been there in months, not since the transfer. He had wrestled with whether to come, unsure if Clement would even receive him. But he needed to, not for closure, but for accountability. When Clement answered the door, he looked older, more tired, but his eyes were sharp. "You finally came," he said simply, stepping aside. Alan entered, hands at his sides, shoulders down. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he began. "Just to say I was wrong, about the company, about her, about everything." Clement studied him. "Took you long enough." Alan gave a short, broken laugh. "I was too proud to see I'd already lost the moment I stopped respecting what I had." The older man nodded, offering him a chair. For the next hour, Alan spoke without defense. He recounted moments of cruelty, confessed to what he used to feel when Sharon cried, and admitted how empty power had become. Clement listened, sipping tea in silence. When Alan finished, the room hung heavy with truth. Clement finally leaned forward. "You were my nephew long before you were a manager, and I watched you become the kind of man your father would have wept to see. But today, I see someone new." Alan's throat tightened. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Clement gave a small smile. "Forgiveness isn't a reward. It's a release, for you and for me." He stood slowly, walked to his cabinet, and pulled out a thick envelope. "These are minutes of the last board meeting. Your name was mentioned. They asked if we'd ever consider you again." Alan raised his head, startled. Clement continued, "I said maybe, if he keeps walking." Then he held Alan's shoulder firmly and said, "Don't stop now. She may not open the door yet, but don't stop." Alan nodded, his eyes wet. "I won't." As he left the house, he looked up at the sky. For the first time, it didn't feel like it was falling. It felt like it was waiting. The invitation came through Tyler, delivered without ceremony. "She'll see you tomorrow," he said. 10 a.m. Conference Room A. Alan sat in the company cafeteria for nearly an hour after that, barely tasting the yam porridge in front of him. He wasn't nervous about the meeting. He was terrified. Not of confrontation, but of the reflection he'd have to face in her eyes. The next morning, he arrived 15 minutes early, dressed simply in a button-down shirt and slacks. No tie, no cologne, no mask. When the door finally opened, Sharon walked in with poise that silenced the room. She wore a wine-colored dress with her natural hair tied into a bun, a leather-bound notebook in hand. "Good morning," she said evenly, settling into the chair across from him. Alan stood, then slowly sat down. "Thank you for seeing me." Sharon didn't smile. She just nodded. "Say what you came to say." He didn't rush. He didn't beg. He spoke slowly, choosing truth over performance. "I came to say I was wrong, for more than the things you know. For the things I never let you say." Sharon listened, her hands folded on the table. "I used to think your silence meant you were weak. But you were just protecting what little you had left." He paused. "And I was tearing it down without even seeing you." A long moment passed. Then Sharon finally spoke. "Do you know what it felt like to carry a man who refused to walk beside me?" Her voice didn't crack. It cut. "To build, support, endure, only to be mocked in rooms I helped you enter?" Alan's eyes welled. "I know now," he whispered. "I've lived it. And I still wouldn't wish it on you." Silence stretched between them, thick and honest. Sharon leaned back slightly. "And what do you want from me now?" He looked at her, not as a man trying to reclaim love, but as one ready to earn forgiveness. "I don't want to come back into your life," he said. "I want to be the kind of man who's worth missing, even if you never miss me." For the first time, Sharon blinked slowly, studying him like a stranger. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing you've ever said to me." And somehow, that was enough, for now. Weeks passed before she called again. No hints, no promises. Just a brief message from Susan. "She wants to see you. Come to her office." Alan climbed the stairs slowly. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood that every step mattered now. When he entered, Sharon was by the window, overlooking the city skyline. "Close the door," she said, her tone unreadable. He obeyed. "You've changed," she began without turning. "People see it. Tyler does. Clement does. Even Genevieve asked me the other day, 'Why does Daddy seem quieter now?'" Alan swallowed, his chest tight. "I don't deserve another chance," he said honestly. "But I'll keep showing up, whether you watch or not." She finally turned to face him, walked to her desk, and opened a drawer. Then, without a word, she handed him a simple, laminated card. He looked down. It was a company ID badge. Title, Special Projects Intern Level. His name was printed clearly beneath it. His throat tightened. Sharon met his eyes. "You're not coming back as my husband. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you can earn your way back into this building. And maybe one day, into our daughter's pride." Alan nodded, unable to speak. She stepped closer, voice low but steady. "This isn't for me. It's for the man you're still becoming." He finally found his voice. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't waste it." She gave a small nod and returned to her desk. "Then get to work. And Alan?" He turned at the door. "Don't ever think silence means surrender. Sometimes it's just a queen choosing peace." He stood there, taking in her strength, her presence. And in that moment, he didn't feel like a failure. He felt like a student in the presence of a master. As he stepped out of her office, badge in hand, Alan finally understood what love looked like when it stopped begging to be seen. It looked like Sharon, whole, powerful, and finally free. Here's the Bible verse, Galatians 6, verse 9 NVE. "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Moral of the story. True strength is not found in loud revenge or bitterness, but in quiet resilience, wisdom, and self-respect. When you choose peace over pride, dignity over drama, and growth over retaliation, you don't just walk away, you rise. Those who misuse love may laugh in your sorrow, but God always plants justice in silence. In the end, the one who endures with grace will stand taller than the one who walked away with arrogance. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.